Welcome back, everybody. I am Carter Sandvin, and this is the channel for Sandbox Illustration. I know that I'm wearing the exact same outfit as the previous video, and that's because I'm just recording both of these, or at least the beginnings of these, in the same day, just to save myself time. Today we are doing another sketch and review, and this is kind of a two-parter. The first part of this sketch and review is going to be discussing the Uncharted movie, and discussing how I feel about adaptations of certain stories into different media. And then the second part of this sketch and review isn't going to be so much a review, but more of a story time, I guess. But it's going to be discussing my personal relationship with the Uncharted video game series and what has led me to the point today where it is still one of my favorite stories and series of all time. Now, I don't want to discuss too much about it. I'd rather just get right into the review for the movie and my discussion of the series. I think I just want to hop right into it. So, let's get to drawing. Before we get into the sketch and review, I want to clarify something. I was actually going to use the second sketch in this video to be discussing my personal relationship with the Uncharted series. I don't think I'm going to do that, though. I think I'm just going to give a brief summary of that at the beginning of this, and then the second sketch will merely just be a quick let's draw. So this video will kind of be a 2-in-1. It'll be a sketch and review and a let's draw. And in fact, let's just get right into that. My personal relationship with the Uncharted series. I don't know if I've stated this before on this channel specifically, but Uncharted is one of my favorite series of all time. When it comes to video games, movies, and comic books, every single series that I've consumed, Uncharted would go in my top 5 of every single series that I've ever consumed. And the reason why I hold the series so highly is, one, I think it has some remarkable characters for just a video game series. Like, I would expect a movie franchise to have characters to this level. The acting is beautiful in it. The gameplay of the entire series can be a lot of fun. And also, the entire premise and the entire context and exploration of the series is one of my personal favorite passions. Not only outdoor exploration and hiking, as you guys know already, but also history. This series actually made me develop a serious interest in a lot of more obscure areas in history, and kind of finding out some of those different conspiracies and mysteries that we find in our textbooks. I originally discovered this game in 2017. I didn't even play it the first time around, and it wasn't even the first game. It was Uncharted 4, and it was actually the playthrough series from Jacksepticeye. But even just seeing the game get played, it instantly grabbed my attention. The entire atmosphere of the game, the style and the tone was so riveting to me that I knew that I just had to try the game for myself. So I eventually bought the game, and I played the fourth one, and then I went and bought the Nathan Drake collection, so I had the first 3, and I've played every single game except for The Lost Legacy. But that's neither really here nor there when it comes to the Uncharted series, in my opinion. I see that game as much more of a loose spin-off rather than an actual part of the series. And ever since then, the story has had such a special place in my heart compared to almost any other series. There are definitely problems with the series. Gameplay, for instance, it can get a little repetitive after a while. It can be a bit too much of the same thing. Some of the games can certainly have pacing problems. I think that this is seen probably the worst in the third game and the fourth game, a little bit of the first game as well. And having the series be this important to me is what made me especially nervous about seeing that an Uncharted movie was being made. Because up until this point, and up until the last few months, I would say, I have always had a strong bias against movie adaptations specifically. Because every time that I've seen a movie adaptation, I have always felt, oh, this is a waste of time, nobody really needs this, it's never going to be truly faithful to the source material, so what is the point? It's just going to be a cash grab from movie studios. And while all of that may be true, I have tried to take the past few months to really consider movie adaptations and story adaptations and try and look at them through a new lens. And I tried this when I saw the Uncharted movie for the first time. And I gotta say, I was genuinely surprised. Now, as I said, when I first saw that this movie was coming out, I was extremely biased just because of my natural turn-off to movie adaptations, but I finally had to put on my big boy pants, majorly with the help of my fiance, and sit down and watch this movie, and I actually thought it was a lot of fun. Now, I don't necessarily know what people online are saying about the movie. Some people may hate it, some people may say it's very boring, but I thought that the movie was kind of a blast to watch. Definitely wasn't an amazing movie, but it was pretty fun. In fact, when I first heard that this movie was coming out, I already planned on making the sketch and review for it, and I even mentioned in a previous video that I didn't think that the sketch and review was going to go well because I really didn't have any hope for this movie. So when I sat down to watch it, I was basically just making the mental notes in my head of what are going to be the problems that I discuss with this. But it turned into something completely different. I tried to not only just sit down with the movie as if I weren't going to review it, but try and look at it from the lens of, don't think of this as an adaptation, just think of it as a movie. And that certainly helped, but I don't want that to be the takeaway of this discussion that we're having today of you should consider every adaptation as just its own story. In fact, it's quite the opposite because, as you guys can see by the title, this entire discussion is going to be what makes a good adaptation. And before we get into that, I just want to discuss some good and bad parts of the movie before we actually get into its relationship with the game series. For one, Tom Holland I thought was actually a really interesting Nathan Drake. I thought that he was really a refresher to the character that I think a movie would need. While he may not have been Nolan North, and I don't think that anybody can beat that performance, I think that Tom Holland brought a very good Nathan Drake to the Uncharted movie. And a lot of the supporting characters were quite good. I thought that Chloe Fraser was a lot of fun in the movie. I liked Sam Drake a lot in the movie. I thought that the villain was very unique. I thought that the villain was very interesting in this movie. I know that I said that I didn't want to discuss the previous games with this, but a big problem that I've usually had with the older Uncharted games is that the villains always kind of seem to be a bore to the rest of the story. While they do add conflict, the villains themselves always found to be quite meh. But I actually thought that the villain this time around was really interesting and really enjoyable to watch as well. There's got to be more to a villain than just an interesting connection to the story or a threat level or an interesting backstory. I thought that Antonio Banderas' character and his sidekick, I can't remember the actress's name right now, I thought that they were both very fitting for this role, and I actually found them to be really fun to watch whenever they were on screen, rather than just, let's get this scene over with. I thought that a lot of the puzzle scenes were very fun to watch. I thought that a lot of the set pieces were very cool. The final battle was the sweetest idea for an Uncharted story that I don't think has ever been in any of the other games. Fighting on a flying pirate ship was extremely cool to see. I thought that Nathan Drake's character, in terms of his writing, was actually really nice in this story. In some ways, maybe even better than the writing in the first game. I don't necessarily mean dialogue and relationships with other characters, but I thought that his motivation this time around was very fitting, especially for what was supposed to be a novice Nathan Drake. I'm sure that there are a few more good things that I could have covered about the story, but I do want to get into some of the bad parts. The biggest bad part of all, and this is going to get into my discussion later on when it comes to a good adaptation, Mark Wahlberg was the worst part of this movie by far. He was extremely boring and bland to watch. It looked like he did not want to be there at all, and there was not an ounce of his acting or his delivery that screamed anything like Victor Sullivan to me. He really was just Victor Sullivan in name. He may have had his place in the story. In fact, I thought that his character arc and his motivations and his flaws were actually kind of nice and really fitting for a story such as this, but Mark Wahlberg really made the movie hard to watch at some points. He just looked so, tired, and I got tired watching him. Some more parts that I had a problem with were the pacing was a little bit off in the story. Certain scenes and certain parts felt like they came a bit too fast, which, to be completely fair, Uncharted has always been in games that were 5 to 10 hours long, and trying to fit that into 2 hours can certainly be a challenge. But because of that, trying to make it feel like an Uncharted story, it felt a bit fast. And my last bad part about the movie, which is purely opinion, and is purely something that I wanted more for myself, but I felt like there was not nearly enough parkour and exploring in this movie than there typically would be. Overall, it felt honestly more like a spy movie than anything. And again, there was enough of it in the movie, but my favorite part of the Uncharted series is seeing Nathan Drake do the parkour around the mountainsides and climbing into the ruins and looking for little treasures, and I didn't feel like there was enough of that in this story. It felt a lot more of it was gunfights and then puzzle scenes, but that really does not matter to the movie. That's just my own personal thing. I just wish I would have seen Nathan Drake scale some mountainsides more than he actually did. Now that we've gotten into my overall feelings with the movie itself, I want to get into the discussion of, is this movie a good adaptation, and what is it that I think is a good adaptation? Now, major disclaimer before we get into this, I'm still feeling very unsettled yet on what actually makes a good adaptation, because I feel like it's just like any other discussion with art. The second that I start to put some parameters around it, there's going to be a ton of exceptions to that rule. And while I understand that my opinion may change tomorrow with what makes a good adaptation, this is what I'm feeling for now. And so you may disagree with it heavily, you may agree with it heavily, we may start a fight over this whole discussion, but I do want to try and express how I feel adaptation should go and where the Uncharted movie lays into that. So I want to start by breaking down what I think are justifications for making an adaptation of a previously made story. The first one is bringing a new audience and a new digestion of the story, mainly through a different medium. This obviously fits very well with adapting books to movies, where you get a whole new side of it to where you can actually see the characters and you can actually see two people interacting with it rather than having to imagine it in your head. Or maybe there were some certain visuals in the story. If it's perhaps a very fantastical fantasy or sci-fi story, you'll finally get to see some of those visuals that were in the source material. And also, book readers and movie watchers aren't necessarily the same groups, so you're bringing a whole new audience to your story if you adapt it through a different medium. And you also get this with video game fans and then movie fans. I'm sure that there will be plenty of people that have never done anything with Uncharted in the past, but now that the movie's out, they'll get to experience it. The next one is bringing a new idea or a new concept to the previous story. If you've ever had a thought in your head of like, oh, what if it was this story? Or what if it was this character, but they were in this scenario? I think that that can always be a fair reason to adapt something. So if you have a completely new idea for a previously written character and you want to see how they would approach that situation themselves rather than a completely original character, I think that that can make for a great story. And then there is paying homage to a previously made story. So if you have a large book series, or if you have a large video game series, or a large comic book series, and you want to make just that one movie to really pay tribute to that story and pay tribute to the fans of the source material, I think that that can be a perfectly fine reason to make a story. Sure, you can say that it's not necessary, but it can make for just as enjoyable of an experience as the source material was for anybody. I think that we see this a lot with Marvel movies and other superhero movies. I think that this was, in fact, I think that this was the main thing that I got out of the Uncharted movie, was I found it more to be a tribute to the original story. You see this a lot with some reused scenes from the games that may not line up chronologically, but they certainly just give you that wave of nostalgia that you got from the games, like the plane crash scene, like you get with Sam being there and you get the ring and all that, or even one of the first scenes where they're going through the auction and trying to steal the cross, kind of like what you got in Uncharted 4. That one may be the quote-unquote weakest reason to make an adaptation of a story, but I think that it's just as justified as any of the other ones. And here are some things that I want to discuss about a lot of people's problems with adaptations, and I want to try and see if I can debunk them. Because the more that I've thought about them, the more that I have found them to not necessarily be fair to the stories. The biggest one has to be people getting too involved in the internal politics and the internal workings of the studios that are making the stories rather than the stories themselves. We see this so much with Disney. We've seen this with the stories like Uncharted. Now, sorry if you guys are going to have a problem with getting into a political discussion, but we see this especially whenever we have a gender swap of a character, or we have a race swap of a character, or we bring in a new theme or a new message about something that is politically related, like equal rights for women or standing up for minorities, things like that. Examples of this would of course be the Little Mermaid remake that's going to be coming out. I believe that they're going to make a Superman story where he's a black man rather than a white man. And what I would say to that is, I don't think that it is fair to attribute the inner workings of the production behind the story to the story itself. You may have a problem with how Disney runs things. You may have a problem with how Universal runs things. You may have a problem with how any studio may work. And that's completely justified. Don't get me wrong. I am not using this to justify the way that Disney makes movies. I find Disney to be nothing but just a corporate money monger that clearly just cares about their profits. But I don't think it's fair to attribute that to the stories themselves. I think that if you're going to have a story like The Little Mermaid, where you have an actress that is black instead of a ginger, I think that that should just be left on its own. I think that the story should be consumed for what the story is, and then that discussion can be completely separate. But I don't think that pinning all of these inner workings onto the movie is necessarily fair. And also, it's not fair to the actresses and the actors that are coming into these movies that are going to be a part of it. People freaking out about the casting of a certain character when that actor is just wanting to take a role. And I think it's completely fine if they want to do that. And I think that we should respect the choices that the casting directors and the directors make for a story. Another one of these complaints that I think is unfair to make is the one of these stories don't have any necessity to them being made. They don't have any purpose behind them. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of story adaptations that you can tell do not need to exist. There are more than enough that I could point out. However, I don't think that the argument of this story already exists, therefore this one doesn't need to, I don't think is completely fair. Because like I pointed out in my list of good reasons to make an adaptation, I think those are more than justified to make any of these adaptations. If someone wants to make a Harry Potter series, if you don't read books, I think that that's completely fair. I think if you're going to adapt comic books, I think that that's completely fair. Now, I can understand that video games are slightly different than that, and I do want to discuss that at this moment. The reason that I do see video games being a bit more different is, in my personal opinion, I've always found books to be probably, at least for myself, the weakest connection to the story in terms of getting immersed into it. Then I would say that comic books are the next one, because you're finally getting that visual aspect to it. And then a movie would be the next step up, because you're finally seeing these characters in real time moving as they naturally would. But then video games are a whole nother level. Not only are you seeing these characters be real people, but you are the character. You are the one making them real people. With you making the choices for them, it takes a whole nother level of immersion for you to connect with these characters. And so I could maybe see the argument where adapting a video game to a movie can be a step back. In fact, maybe that is one of the biggest issues that we've had with the curse of video game adaptations. And while I will concede on that maybe a movie adaptation isn't necessary for a video game, since a video game just has that next level to it, I do still want to be fair to the movies that are made from these video games, whether they're bad or not, looking at them strictly as adaptations, because I think that if you want to bring a new audience to a story, or if you want to bring a new idea to a story, I think that you have the full rights to. Now, sort of piggybacking onto that previous topic, I want to get into what I think makes a bad adaptation, and I really think that there are only 3 majorly bad forms of an adaptation. The first one is where it is nothing at all similar to the previous story, where it is essentially just an adaptation in name. This is where the story doesn't line up, it doesn't hold the same themes as the original story, none of the characters act the same, none of the characters do the same things. It's where you feel a complete void of the original spirit of that story. Characters don't have to do the exact same things, and the story doesn't need to be the exact same, but you still need to look at that and feel in yourself that is an adaptation of that previous story, rather than just, oh, by the way, this is the Harry Potter story. I was merely just using an example. I don't really know anything about the Harry Potter movies. Another bad adaptation, I would say, is the carbon copy, where it is just the exact same, because that right there is truly a useless adaptation. If you are going to copy the story beat for beat and have nothing at all change from the first one, I think that can be just as bad, because that truly doesn't have a necessity to it. You're not bringing anything new to this story that you would from the previous one, especially if it would be a video game. Because like I said, you're already losing that level of immersion, and now there's nothing new being brought to the audience. I think that can be a total detriment. This next one is probably the most controversial, and the one where I could probably find the most exceptions for it, but I think that this really encompasses all of my problems with previous adaptations, which is different characters, but the same stories. The adaptation may follow the same plot beats, but the characters are not at all like their source characters. I think a good example of this, partially, I think that we can see in the first Amazing Spider-Man movie. My biggest problem with that movie, while it was fun at times, I personally felt like the Peter Parker that we got was just not Peter Parker. I felt like the Peter Parker that we got was a skater punk that was irresponsible and didn't know how to handle these new powers that he got. Which, by the way, that would be an awesome story on its own. You get someone who is a very immature person and who is completely reckless and dangerous, and they get these really strong powers, and they actually use them to become a villain, and they actually use them for vengeance rather than doing it for good. But that's just not Spider-Man to me personally. Every time that I've consumed a Spider-Man story, I felt he may not know what he's doing, but you know that his heart is in the right place. I think that this was shown greatly through the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. And while The Amazing Spider-Man may have followed the typical story points of a Spider-Man movie, where you have him getting his powers from being bitten by the spider, Uncle Ben dies, then he becomes Spider-Man, then he fights a major villain, but it didn't feel like Peter Parker was there. It felt like another random character was there. And so this is where I want to get into what I think is, in my opinion, the ideal adaptation. If I were to sit down at the writing table and I were given full rights to adapt any story that I wanted to in any way that I wanted to. If I were sitting down at the writing table and I were given full rights to adapt any story available in any way that I wanted to, the way that I would want to do it personally is keep the same characters. You want to keep the characters' personality. You want to keep their motivations. You want to keep their major flaws. You want to keep what is driving them as not only a character, but a person. But put them in a completely new scenario. Say that you had a story where you wanted to write Cinderella gets a superpower, or she becomes a witch herself, or something like that. Or even something crazy like you wanted to see Nathan Drake in the apocalypse. I think that would be the best way to do an adaptation. If you can see that character and who they are in a completely unique scenario, I think that can be the most enjoyable experience for any audience, not only for the moviegoer that may see it, but also for the original fans of the story, when they get a completely new lens on the characters that they know and love. And that's what I would keep in mind with adaptations is, I guess at the end of the day, if you really want to break it down, you could say that adaptations don't need to happen, but guess what? The movies are already made. They're already going to be made. You can't stop it. So you might as well just treat it like a story, and you might as well look at it and how it benefits the previous one. And I think that the best way to do that is to not only bring your own unique ideas to this world, but also keep the heart and soul of the story that we first loved. Everybody, that was my twofer YouTube video that I just did, the sketch and review of the Uncharted movie, and the Let's Draw of the evolution of Nathan Drake. Not much to explain with the sketches. Obviously in the first one, you have video game Nathan Drake going up against movie Nathan Drake. And then in the second sketch, I thought was a really creative pull-off with the whole thing, which is showing Nathan Drake in Uncharted 4 and then his entire evolution through the whole series, going all the way from him being a kid to him being an older man. And looking back on it now, I think it was a much better fit to treat that second sketch as more of a tribute to the game rather than putting a discussion or a recording over the sketch itself. I think just having the sketch be on its own, I think that was a good fit for it. I think it paid the right homage to the game and to the piece, and I don't think that I really have much else to say. I'm really happy with both sketches. They took me longer than I wanted to, but there was just a lot that I had to do with technical little things and trying to pull off the sketches in the way that I wanted them, but I think it really worked for both of them. And I was also happy with the discussion. I was really happy with my thoughts that I presented on the discussion of what makes a good adaptation for any kind of story. And I would love to know what you guys thought about it too. I would love to know if you guys disagree with me, if you have some serious heavy disagreements with me, some serious agreements with me, some extra thoughts from you. I would love to hear all of them if you guys have them. And I think that's all that I have to say today. So thank you guys so much for watching. This was Carter Sandvin with Sandbox Illustration. Make sure to check in the description for links to more of my content, and then like the video, comment on it, and subscribe for weekly art and treasure hunting related videos. Anyways, have fun, dudes.